Recently, in the country of Cuba, thousands of people have taken to the streets to protest the shortages of medical supplies, food, electricity, and to demand an end to the authoritarian dictatorship in the country. Now, in response to this, the US President Joe Biden has released a statement stating that the, quote, United States stands firmly with the people of Cuba. However, while that rhetoric is admirable, it doesn't line up with the policy of the Biden administration, and the policy is what matters. And the policy of the Biden administration is a contributing factor to the poor situation in Cuba, particularly the US economic sanctions and embargo on the country of Cuba. Now, for about 50-ish years, there has been sanctions on the country of Cuba until Barack Obama lifted the sanctions and the embargo, and then the sanctions were not there until Donald Trump reinstated the sanctions and the embargo on the country of Cuba. And Joe Biden has been president for a few months now, and at this point it's his responsibility as to the state of the sanctions on Cuba. And Biden could get rid of the sanctions in a day. He could have done it yesterday. He could have done it last week. He could have done it on day one, but he made a conscious decision to not do that. And it's his responsibility, and ultimately on this issue, the Biden administration is just wrong. And the best way to help the people of Cuba right now, from the perspective of the United States and the Biden administration, is to lift the economic sanctions and the embargo on Cuba. Lift the sanctions, lift the embargo. Now, the mayor of Miami, as well as others as well, have called for the US government to militarily intervene in Cuba or otherwise try to do regime change in Cuba. And I think that this is the wrong course of action. The US should not militarily intervene in Cuba. The US should not try to do regime change in Cuba. The United States should lift the sanctions on Cuba, continue to state support for and be in solidarity with the people in Cuba who are protesting the authoritarian government. However, they should not militarily intervene or try to do regime change in Cuba, because that'll just be like the Bay of Pigs all over again. And if you guys don't know, the Bay of Pigs incident was an incident in the Cold War during the 1900s, in which the United States tried to overthrow the government of Cuba. And it didn't work, and the Cuban government remained in power. Now, the point isn't that it won't work. It might work, it might not. But that's not the point. The point isn't whether or not the Cuban government will remain in power and whether or not it'll be successful. The US government, historically speaking, has a habit of trying to do regime change and overthrowing governments in foreign countries. Whether it's successful coups and regime change movements in Libya and Iraq, or whether it's unsuccessful coups and regime change movements in the Bay of Pigs in the Cold War for Cuba and in Venezuela. And it's under both Democratic and Republican presidents. Under a Democratic president, John F. Kennedy, the U.S. government tried to overthrow Cuba. Under a Democratic president, Barack Obama, the U.S. government successfully tried to overthrow the government of Libya. Under Republican presidents like George W. Bush and Donald Trump, the U.S. government successfully and unsuccessfully tried to overthrow the governments of Iraq and Venezuela. And this policy, this habit of trying to do regime change in countries with authoritarian governments, where they look at, okay, this country, the government is not good. The government is authoritarian. The government does human rights violations. That's not a justification for the U.S. government to try to overthrow that country for two main reasons. One, when it does work, like it has in Libya and Iraq, it does not end well because the situation does not remain stable. For example, if Iraq had not been invaded and destabilized ISIS would have never come to power in that region. The area would be much safer and much more stable. I wouldn't say it would be prosperous. It would be under the rule of an authoritarian government under Saddam Hussein. But but it was destabilized, and destabilization is not good. Same thing with Libya. Chaos followed in Libya because once you invade a country, you need to have a plan for resetting the government afterwards, and oftentimes there is no plan. The second reason is that just as a matter of principle, it is not correct to invade or attempt to overthrow the governments of other countries. And I want to make a point here that the US government's opposition to the Cuban government is not 100% based on goodwill because the Cuban government is bad. The Cuban government is an authoritarian government that has violated human rights and has brutally and violently suppressed the protests going on there. I know for a fact from a primary source online, from a person living in Cuba, participating in the protests, that a 13-year-old boy was killed by Cuban police during the protests. Cuban police have fired into crowds. They have arrested peaceful protesters. There are reports of protesters going missing. This is just authoritarianism. This is dictatorship. These are human rights violations. The Cuban government is not good. But that is not a justification for the US to invade a country. The US is not and should not be the police of the world that invades and tries to overthrow countries that are authoritarian. And another thing is that the US government, like I was alluding to before, is not merely opposed to the Cuban government because Cuba is authoritarian. It's possible, to be charitable and to give the benefit of the doubt to the Biden administration. It's possible that that's the Biden administration's stance on it, that we are opposed to the Cuban government because the Cuban government is authoritarian. But the origins of US opposition to Cuba are not that. There was a dictator in Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, who was backed by the US government, and he was a dictator. He violated human rights, he was authoritarian, etc., etc. And the US backed him, and this was during the Cold War. And basically, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara overthrew Batista's government and created a new dictatorship. And that dictatorship was brutal and authoritarian and violated human rights. Now, the Cuban government points out, defenders of the Cuban government and the Cuban government themselves have pointed out about, the education initiatives, the healthcare initiatives. And while it is true that Fidel Castro's government did better in terms of education and healthcare compared to the Batista government, and that Cuban healthcare is actually remarkable. It's actually remarkable what the country of Cuba have done with healthcare. They are ranked at number 39 out of all the countries in the world by healthcare, number 39. To put that into perspective, the United States is at number 37. And Cuba is a significantly poorer country than the United States. But that does not excuse the authoritarianism and the human rights violations of the Cuban government. It's just an excuse that the Cuban government is making. And it's not relevant to the debate internally in Cuba today about whether the government in Cuba is bad or not. The government of Cuba is authoritarian, it's brutal, it's a dictatorship, they violate human rights, it's not good. I hope the Cuban people are successful in having their demands met, but the US government cannot interfere militarily. They should not interfere militarily with the Cuban government. They should not try to do regime change like they tried to do and sometimes did in Iraq, in Libya, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Guatemala, in Iran. There's probably a few other countries as well that I haven't said. But military intervention is not the right course of action. The right course of action is to remove the economic sanctions, which is not too much to ask. It's not out of the ordinary. In fact, I would not be surprised if in the coming days, pressure from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party on Joe Biden caused Joe Biden to lift the sanctions. I would not be surprised if Joe Biden lifted the sanctions in the coming days, because Obama did it. And Biden is the vice president under the Obama administration. But he hasn't done it yet, and right now, as of the filming of this video, Biden has not lifted the sanctions. He needs to lift the sanctions, and until he does, he is wrong on this issue. He is not good on this issue. And they need to lift the sanctions, and that is the number one thing that the United States can do to help the people of Cuba at this time. Now, the second part of what the Biden administration should do is to ignore the calls for military intervention and regime change in Cuba. The United States should not do regime change in Cuba. So far, and Biden's only been in power for a few months, but the Biden administration so far has not tried to do regime change in any countries or try to overthrow any governments so far. And the past three presidents have. Bush in Iraq, Obama in Libya, Trump in Venezuela, whether or not they've been successful. And Biden hasn't done any of that stuff yet. And I hope that it stays that way, and he should keep it that way, and he should not try to do regime change or military intervention or an overthrow or a coup in Cuba. He should not. There's also a domestic U.S. political aspect to this as well, which is that in the 2020 election, Donald Trump actually gained among Hispanic voters, specifically because of Hispanic voters that were immigrants from, or had relatives that were immigrants from, or had relatives in countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and countries with far left governments that are not very developed, or that are authoritarian, or that are dictatorships. So, for example, Venezuela is an authoritarian government that is generally associated with socialism and communism, and the same is true of Cuba. And because of that, Donald Trump stated that Biden is a socialist, Biden is a communist, which, by the way, is just not true. Socialism and communism are not just words, they have definitions. And by those definitions, Biden is not a socialist or a communist. Not a single major Democrat is a socialist or a communist. It's just a talking point that Trump used to try to polarize the election and use fear of socialism and communism to try and help him win the election. It didn't work, but it did work in the state of Florida. And Cuban Americans in particular, they did vote for Trump more than they did in 2016. And Biden is probably trying to tread carefully around the issue of Cuba because he doesn't want to completely lose the Cuban American vote. So a lot of these Cuban Americans are immigrants from Cuba, or they have relatives in Cuba, and understandably, they don't like the authoritarian government in Cuba that has been violating human rights. So, and it's very likely that Republicans can attack Biden for being soft on Cuba if he lifts the sanctions, or even if he doesn't lift the sanctions and doesn't do military intervention, they might call him soft on Cuba. The senator from Florida, Republican senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, has already criticized Biden for taking too long to release a statement, as if the time it takes to release a statement has any effect on the actual issues in Cuba. Of course, he's not talking about Biden's sanctions on Cuba, because generally Republicans and conservatives are pro-sanction. But those are the major analyses and takeaways from the situation. People in Cuba are protesting because of a shortage of food, shortage of medical supplies, and because of the shortage of freedom. And certain aspects of this, the shortage of food and medical supplies, are due to the U.S. sanctions, and that's why Biden needs to end the U.S. sanctions. The Cuban government is violently repressing the protests, and they're violating human rights. People are calling for Biden to intervene in Cuba. He should not. He should not militarily intervene in Cuba. He should not do regime change. This should not be the Bay of Pigs 2.0. This should not be Guatemala. For some background history, during the Cold War, the government of the United States overthrew a democratically elected government in Guatemala, because the democratically elected government in Guatemala was backed and had relations with the Soviet Union, and it was a left-leaning government, and they didn't want the Soviet Union to gain influence. So they overthrew the government, replaced it with a capitalist, backed by the United States, dictatorship in Guatemala. They tried to do that in Cuba, it didn't work. They did in Iraq, they tried to overthrow the government in Iraq, it worked. They tried to overthrow the government in Libya, it worked. They tried to overthrow the government in Venezuela, it didn't work. This habit that the United States has of trying to overthrow individual countries is not good. And it goes against the principles that our country was founded upon. And the United States should not continue this habit. I will say this about Donald Trump, he did not do this. Well, he did do it to Venezuela, but he didn't do it where it worked. Actually, that's a dumb excuse. He did do it to Venezuela. He was bad on that too. However, Biden, if he doesn't do it, there's a possibility that this could be the first presidential administration of the 21st century in the United States that does not try to overthrow a foreign government or have a coup. And along with the fact that Biden is withdrawing from Afghanistan, hopefully, if Biden withdraws from Afghanistan, lifts the sanctions, doesn't do military intervention in Cuba, doesn't do military intervention in any country for the rest of his term, this could mark a shift in foreign policy that would be beneficial for the United States. But furthermore, as I was saying, summarizing the points in the video, there's a political aspect to this as well, with Republicans criticizing Biden already for being too soft on Cuba, as if the time it takes for him to release a statement makes a difference. Like they're acting like if Biden had released a statement 3 hours earlier, there would have been more medical supplies in Cuba or something. And those criticisms are not really valid, but they are criticizing Biden for being soft on Cuba, and Biden probably doesn't want to lose Cuban Americans' votes in Florida, because Florida is a swing state. And that might be part of the reason why he is treading carefully around the issue of Cuba. But frankly, these political calculations should be irrelevant to policy, because policy should be about what is actually the correct policy. And Biden won the 2020 election without Florida anyway. Biden needs to end the sanctions. He needs to ignore the calls for military intervention and regime change. He needs to not do military intervention and regime change in Cuba. He needs to refrain from that. He needs to use restraint. Restraint is the better option here. He needs to end the sanctions. He needs to use restraint. And he needs to leave political calculations out of this. And I hope the people of Cuba are successful in their demands. And the government of Cuba needs to stop violating human rights, and they need to stop being authoritarian. And those are, in my opinion, the major takeaways on this issue. Biden needs to end the sanctions. Biden should not do regime change in Cuba. The Cuban government needs to stop being authoritarian. And there's probably a political aspect to this as well, which is Joe Biden does not want to lose Cuban Americans' votes. Thank you.